They say the land does not care who works it. I have found that to be true. It did not matter to the red soil that I was born in Ryazan Oblast, that I learned to plow behind my grandfather's tractor when I was 9 years old, that I had calloused hands before I had a man's voice. It did not matter that the air I breathed as a boy smelled of birch sap and diesel, and the particular sweetness of black earth after rain. The land did not care. It only cared that you showed up every morning, that you bent your back when the work required it, and that you stayed when every sensible creature would have left. I stayed. That is the whole story if you want the short version, but you asked for the long one, so here it is. My name is Nikolai Petrovich Volkov. I am 63 years old, and I have farmed the same crater on Mars for 19 years. Before that, I farmed a patch of ground outside Kasimov that my family had worked for 4 generations, until the corporation bought the district water rights and made it impossible to operate. I did not fight them. I had a wife and a daughter, and I was not yet old enough to understand what I was giving away. I signed the papers they put in front of me, and I walked off land that my great-grandfather had broken with a horse-drawn plow, and I went to the city, and I felt myself become something less than what I had been. Before the farm in Kasimov, I served 11 years in the engineering corps, maintaining equipment in places whose names I am not allowed to say in a public account. You learn things in that service. You learn how machines work at their limit, and you learn how institutions fail under pressure, and you learn something harder to name. A quality of mind that looks at a problem and does not waste time wishing it were a different problem, but instead asks what is available and what is possible, and then gets to work. That quality of mind has served me better than any formal education I received, including the agronomy degree I completed at 37, while my wife was pregnant with our second child, and I was trying to rebuild what the corporation had taken. All 3 of those educations, machines, institutions, land, came into service during what we eventually called the Lattice Winter, though winter is a strange word for what happened on Mars, where the seasons are twice as long, and the cold is not seasonal but permanent at the poles and merely severe everywhere else. I call it winter because of what it did to the light, because of what it did to the color of the sky, and because of what it cost us, which was more than I want to calculate even now, looking back with the clarity that distance provides. Let me tell you about the crater first. We called it Krasny Kotlovan, Red Pit, in the plain translation, though Kotlovan has a Soviet-era weight to it, a sense of excavation, of construction begun in defiance of geography. That weight was intentional. The first colonists named it during the 2nd decade of the program, when the tone was still earnest, and the promotional posters still showed smiling technicians under a green-tinged sky, and the slogans on the settlement office walls read, "We will make the red planet green," in letters that someone had painted with genuine conviction. By the time I arrived, the smiling had stopped and the slogans had faded and the paint was chipping, but the name had stuck because names always outlast the mood that produced them. The crater was 11 kilometers across. The walls ran 40 meters high on the north and east, enough to break the worst of the wind and hold a modest atmosphere inside the deflector net. We had 2.3% more oxygen at crater bottom than the Martian standard, which sounds like nothing until you've worked at standard and you know what it costs your lungs, what it does to your concentration, the particular gray fog that settles behind your eyes when you've been breathing thin air for too many hours. Inside the rim, with the deflector net active, you could work in a light breather rather than a full suit. Your skin still cracked in the dry season. Your sinuses still bled. But you could feel the soil through your gloves if they were thin enough, and that mattered. It mattered to me in a way that I could not have explained to anyone who had not lost land and then found it again. The farm occupied the southern quarter of the crater floor, roughly 300 hectares, bounded on the east by the drainage canal, and on the west by the supply road that the Izhevsk Dynamics Corporation had graded into the crater wall in 2087, when they established the relay station on the rim. I had a working arrangement with Izhevsk Dynamics. They used my road access for their supply convoys. I used their power grid for the deflector net and the seed bank climate systems. We did not like each other. Their regional director, a man named Fedorov whom I had met 4 times and disliked thoroughly on each occasion, was the kind of man who looked at a farm and saw inefficient land use. I was the kind of man who looked at a relay station and saw expensive equipment serving corporate priorities that had nothing to do with feeding people. We were useful to each other, and on Mars, usefulness is the primary currency of peace, so we maintained peace. And we did it through the specific form of courtesy that is really just the controlled suppression of contempt. I had 6 humanoid workers, not robots in the old sense, not the simple automatons that had done factory work since the 20th century, but genuine labor platforms, grown from the Izhevsk Dynamics 3rd generation series. They could operate any piece of equipment on the farm, assess crop conditions without instruments, perform basic structural repairs, and hold a conversation, though their conversation was peculiar, precise, and earnest in a way that made you feel the absence of irony, which can be exhausting in a coworker, but is actually quite restful in a farmhand. You never had to wonder if they were being sarcastic. You never had to read a secondary meaning into their reports. When Andrei told you the north fence needed a post replaced, he meant the north fence needed a post replaced. There was a purity to that I had come to value. I called them by the names printed on their registration plates: Andrei, Boris, Vanya, Masha, Oksana, and the one with the bent primary actuator in his right shoulder, whom I called Krivy, crooked, which he accepted without complaint, as he accepted most things, with the mechanical equanimity of a well-made tool that does not have opinions about its nickname. Krivy had developed his limitation 2 years earlier, when a structural beam had fallen on him during a barn repair. The repair kit I needed to fix his shoulder fully was on backorder from the Izhevsk Dynamics Supply Depot for 14 months and counting. In the meantime, Krivy had adapted. The damaged actuator had changed his range of motion in ways that, paradoxically, gave him unusual precision on close work, the body compensating for the injury by developing new movement patterns around it. He was the best at fine mechanical work of all of them, now, which I found philosophically instructive in ways I did not share with anyone because I was aware it would sound maudlin. We grew food. That is what farmers do, but what we grew on Mars was not what grows anywhere else. The gravity is different, 38% of Earth standard, which changes the way cells elongate, the way water distributes through plant tissue, the way roots interpret the directional signal that tells them which way is down. The light is different, dimmer, more red-shifted, less in the blue-violet range that most plant photosynthesis relies on, which means you either supplement with spectrum lighting or you select and develop strains that have adapted to work with what the sun provides. The radiation that comes through even the best deflector netting changes cellular behavior in ways that the agronomists in Moscow and the agronomists in Houston and the agronomists at the new Volgograd Agricultural Research Center spent 3 decades pretending to fully understand, publishing papers with confident titles and hedged conclusions, until the actual farmers figured out by trial and error what the papers were slowly circling around. The result was produce that had no precise equivalent on Earth. My specialty was what I call the angular vegetables, cucumbers that grew in fractal branching patterns, tessellating back on themselves, a single plant producing perhaps 80% more surface area than a terrestrial variety. More surface area meant more photosynthesis. More photosynthesis meant more yield per square meter. And in a habitat where every square meter had been won from bare rock at significant cost, yield per square meter was the number that determined whether you ate. The flavor of these cucumbers was unlike anything grown on Earth, more mineral, slightly bitter at the branch points, with a sweetness at the heart that intensified as they matured. I had sent samples to the university at New Volgograd, and they had run 16 separate analyses and produced 2 papers and a graduate thesis, and still described the flavor in terms that made it clear they had never actually eaten one. I had eaten thousands of them. They tasted like what they were, the result of a plant working very hard in difficult circumstances and succeeding. My carrots grew in helical shapes under Martian gravity gradients. The differential between surface and root tip gravity, however slight, had selected over 8 generations of cultivation for a growth pattern that exploited the gradient to draw water upward more efficiently. They were denser than anything grown on Earth, with a sweetness that came from the slow accumulation of simple sugars during the long Martian seasons, each season half again as long as an Earth year, time for flavors to develop that rushed terrestrial growing cycles never allowed. My mushrooms fruited in geometric clusters, each cap a perfect hexagon, the mycelium running in straight lines through the soil rather than the irregular branching of Earth fungi. The mycologist who had studied them on a research visit had told me the straight-line mycelium appeared to be a response to subsurface pressure gradients unique to the compacted regolith that underlay the crater floor. My grandfather would not have recognized any of it. But it fed people, and in the outer settlements, where supply chains broke down every other season and resupply missions from Earth were expensive and sometimes delayed by politics or by physics or by the simple indifference of distance. Food that grew was worth more than food that was familiar. I had 900 head of cattle, real cattle, Earth cattle, Hereford and Kostroma breeds that had been brought to Mars in embryo form and raised under supplemental UV, their hides thickened by the cold, their temperaments adjusted by generations of selection for docility in enclosed spaces. Because cattle that panic in a habitat can kill people, and the selection pressure for calm had been intense. They were not identical to their Earth ancestors. Nothing on Mars is identical to its Earth ancestor, but they were recognizably cattle, and they gave recognizable milk, and the butter made from that milk was, according to everyone who had tasted both, actually better than Earth butter. Something about the fat content, the way the Martian mineral profile of the grass came through in the flavor. This was a source of small pride to me. The Ijevsk Dynamics milk platform Oksana handled most of the dairy work, but I still did my own rounds at dawn. Old habit. There is information in watching cattle that no sensor array delivers as well, the way an animal holds its weight, the quality of its attention to its surroundings, whether it is breathing shallowly or deeply, whether it approaches the gate with confidence or hangs back. Cattle are not complicated, but they are accurate. When a herd of cattle is wrong, something is wrong. This is not a mystery. It is 8,000 years of coevolution between a prey species that survived by being sensitive to threat and a human species that survived by being attentive to what its animals were telling it. I had a wife, Galina, who communicated with me primarily through a screen that she had mounted on a hover frame, so it could follow me around the farm during her shifts at the settlement clinic 14 kilometers north. This was not her idea of a perfect marriage arrangement. It was not mine either. But the farm required my physical presence. There were things that happened here that the labor platforms could not manage alone, judgment calls that required someone who understood not just the systems but the patterns, who had walked this ground for 19 years, and knew what it felt like when it was right, and what it felt like when it was wrong. And the clinic required her presence, because she was the only licensed trauma physician within 200 kilometers, and the nearest alternative was a field medic at the Ijevsk Dynamics relay station, who had completed a 6-month certification course and whose hands shook on the sutures. We had made our accommodations. We were not young. We had learned to love each other across distances. I had a black hole. That last item requires explanation, though perhaps less than you imagine. The waste disposal system installed by the original crater developers used a contained gravitational singularity no larger than a pinhead, maintained in a ceramic cylinder, housing sunk 12 meters into the crater floor through a bored shaft behind the equipment barn. It consumed organic waste at a molecular level. Material placed in contact with the housing surface was drawn across the event horizon and ceased to exist in any form accessible to the universe on this side of the horizon. No methane buildup, no contamination of the water table, no smell, no residue. Completely clean, completely silent. The technology had been developed for deep space waste management on long-haul vessels, where you cannot vent waste into space because the debris clouds accumulate around the transit corridors, and you cannot store it because storage weight is propulsion cost, and you cannot process it conventionally because conventional processing requires water and energy you don't have in surplus. The singularity solution was elegant in the way that truly desperate engineering is elegant. It solved the problem absolutely, at the cost of requiring an object that should not exist to be maintained in a ceramic tube behind an outhouse. The developer who had leased the crater in 2079 had been, by all accounts, a man of extravagant solutions, and I had inherited his outhouse. It worked perfectly. I serviced it once a year, replacing the containment seals and running the diagnostic cycle recommended in the manual that came with it. A document written in technical language so dense that I had needed 3 readings and a conversation with an engineer at New Volgograd to fully understand it. I never thought about it much, until the lattice came, and then I thought about it every day for reasons that had nothing to do with waste disposal. I am describing all of this: the farm, the platform workers, the cattle, the angular vegetables, the singularity housing, because you need to understand what we had before I tell you what we lost. You need to feel the weight of the place, the labor of it, the years of it, the specific stubbornness it takes to make a farm out of a crater on a dead planet. Because when I tell you what arrived in the autumn of year 19, you might otherwise think, why didn't you just leave? And the answer is that leaving would have been a kind of death, not the physical kind, the other kind, the kind where you survive but something essential in you does not. I had already done that once in Kasimov. I was not going to do it again. The first sign was the seismic. Mars has its own geology, Marsquarks. The scientists call them with a faint self-consciousness, as if they know the word is slightly ridiculous but have accepted it because language is what we have and precision matters less than communication. They happen regularly in certain zones, the product of thermal contraction in the cooling planetary core and tidal stress from the moons, which are small but close enough to matter over geological time. Our crater was in a stable band, geologically speaking. We had not logged significant seismic activity in the 11 years I had been keeping records. So when Andre reported an unusual vibration pattern in the drainage canal sensors on the 14th day of 7th month, I paid attention in the way you pay attention when something you trust is telling you that something is different. The pattern was not a Marsquark. I had the signature of those on file, a sharp onset, an irregular decay, a frequency distribution that was broad and chaotic in the way that geological stress release is always chaotic. This was different, regular, rhythmic. A subsurface wave with a periodicity of approximately 47 minutes, propagating from the southwest at a bearing that, when I traced it back on the survey map, originated somewhere in the deep basin country beyond the crater rim. 200 kilometers of undeveloped terrain that the colonization surveys had classified as geologically inert and economically uninteresting, and had not visited in 12 years. I reported it to the Izhevsk Dynamics relay station on the rim. The technician on duty, a young man named Stepan who had come from Novosibirsk on a 3-year contract and still looked vaguely surprised every morning to find himself on Mars, ran the signal through his equipment and told me it was probably a thermal vent shifting under the pressure of seasonal temperature change. I told him the thermal vent catalog showed nothing within 300 kilometers of that bearing. He told me the catalog was 12 years old. That was true. I let it go. There are battles worth fighting with institutions and battles that are not. And arguing with a relay station technician in month 9 of his contract about the thermal vent catalog is the second kind. 6 days later, the cattle started refusing the western pasture. Refusing is the right word. Not spooking, not running, not the particular sharp bolting motion of cattle that have seen a predator. There are no predators on Mars, but the instinct is encoded deep enough that the cattle still carry it, still react to sudden movement and unfamiliar smells with the nervous energy of prey animals even after generations of selection for calm. This was different. They declined to cross the invisible line that separated the eastern paddock from the western, standing at the boundary in the early morning and looking westward with a stillness that had no precedent in my 19 years of watching this herd. Cattle are not still animals. They shift and graze and move their ears continuously, processing information through a body that is built to be in motion. These animals stood like statues. I went to look. The western pasture showed nothing abnormal to the eye. The frost grass was the same frost-colored pale green it always was. The soil temperature readings were within normal range. The air quality monitor showed nothing unusual. But when I knelt and put my hand flat on the ground, I could feel it, a faint vibration, barely perceptible, like the resonance of a very large and very distant machine felt through the floor of a building rather than heard through the air. The 47-minute periodicity. Stronger now, close enough to feel. I stood up and looked southwest toward the crater wall. The basalt was unchanged. The deflector net strands caught the morning light the same way they always did. Nothing moved. I called Galena that evening. Her face on the hover screen was the same face I had married 31 years ago, though the lines around her eyes had deepened in ways that Mars accelerates. The dry air, the radiation, the accumulated weight of being the person that sick people call at 2 in the morning. She listened to me describe the cattle and the subsurface readings with the expression of a woman who has heard a great many theories from her husband and has learned to distinguish the ones worth worrying about from the ones that are late-evening speculation, amplified by the particular loneliness of crater life. "Call the survey office," she said. "They'll tell me to fill out a form." "Then fill out the form, Nikolai. This is what institutions are for." She was right. I filled out the form. The response came 11 days later. The settlement authority had logged my report and assigned it to the geological monitoring queue, estimated review time 4 to 6 months. Standard procedure. I had the form letter memorized by the third line. I had received variants of it on 7 previous occasions for 7 previous reports about conditions that had eventually proven to be real and significant. Institutions move at the speed they move. By then, we had already seen the first lattice. It emerged from the southwest face of the crater wall on the 22nd day of 7th month, at approximately 3:40 local time, which is why Andre found it and not me. He had been running the overnight check of the deflector net anchor points, a task I had given him because he was thorough, and because the overnight hours were otherwise underutilized, and because I had taken to sleeping somewhat better since I gave the night monitoring to someone reliable. His visual sensors caught it on the wall, a cluster of crystalline structures, each one perhaps 30 centimeters tall, growing in a perfectly regular hexagonal array on the basalt face of the crater rim, 12 meters up from the floor. They had not been there the previous morning. The growth rate, working backward from their size and the time elapsed since the last visual check, was approximately 2 centimeters per hour. Andre woke me at 4:07. He stood in the doorway of the farmhouse in the dim interior light and described what he had found in his characteristic way, precise, without emphasis, presenting the facts in the order of their relevance. He did not say he was worried. He did not know how to say he was worried, but the fact that he had woken me rather than logging the observation for the morning report told me everything about his assessment of its urgency. I pulled on my suit and went out into the pre-dawn cold. They were beautiful, if I am being honest. The way the polar light caught them, that thin, reddish Martian pre-dawn that is unlike any light anywhere else, a light that makes the whole world look like the interior of a furnace scene from a great distance, as if Mars is lit from inside by something cooling. The facets scattered it in moving patterns across the crater floor, shifting as the wind moved the ambient atmosphere, casting geometrically perfect shadows on the basalt. I stood and watched them for several minutes before I thought to be afraid, before the pattern of them registered as something other than a natural phenomenon, before the regularity of the hexagonal array, the absolute mathematical perfection of the spacing, began to feel not like geology but like intention. I took samples with the collection kit from the equipment barn, chipping fragments with a geologist's pick, sealing them in sterile containers. The crystals resisted the pick more than any natural rock formation I had worked with, but they were not indestructible. They came free in sharp-edged pieces that caught the growing light and scattered it across my gloves in moving points. I ran what analysis I could with the farm's equipment. Silicon-based crystalline matrix, organized along geometric lines consistent with no natural mineral formation I had in my reference library. The internal structure, visible under the farm's optical microscope, was not random in the way that natural crystals are random at the microscopic level. Natural crystals have imperfections, variations in lattice spacing, inclusions of foreign material, the record of their formation environment written in their structure. These had none of that. Every lattice junction replicated the same configuration, billions of times over, with a precision that would have been impossible to manufacture by any industrial process I knew of, at any scale I could imagine. I sent the samples to the settlement laboratory at New Volgograd with a detailed note explaining what I had found, where I had found it, the growth rate estimate, and the subsurface vibration readings that had preceded the appearance by more than a month. The laboratory director, a woman named Irina Sorokina, whom I had met twice at the annual colonist assembly, a compact woman with the precise economy of motion of someone who spent most of her time at instruments, called me back within 6 hours. That response time told me she had recognized something in the samples that concerned her. Scientists do not call farmers back in 6 hours when the news is nothing. "These are not Martian in origin," she said. Her voice was careful in the way that scientists' voices get when they are controlling something, not the performance of calm, but the real thing, the practiced discipline of a person who knows that panic serves no one. "I know they're not Martian," I said. "I mean they're not from this solar system, Nikolai Petrovich. The isotope ratios are wrong. The silicon-28 to silicon-29 ratio is outside any known planetary range, including the full catalog of meteorite samples and cometary material. The silicon-30 distribution is equally anomalous. Whatever formed these crystals formed them in a stellar environment with different nucleosynthetic history than our Sun. They are from somewhere else." I looked at the southwest wall of my crater, where the hexagonal array had grown another 8 centimeters since dawn, where 2 additional clusters had appeared overnight at irregular intervals along the basalt face. "How old are they?" I asked. "The active matrix has been growing for approximately 11 weeks, based on the crystalline growth front. But the base substrate, the seed material, the core structures from which the current growth is propagating, that's much older. Possibly millions of years, possibly more. The isotopic decay signatures are not consistent with any time frame I can bound with confidence at the high end. Millions of years. Something had been waiting under the Martian rock for millions of years. Patient in the way that only an inanimate object can be patient. The patience of stone, of deep ice, of orbital mechanics. And now it was waking. "What does it want?" I asked. It was an unscientific question and I knew it. "We don't know that it wants anything in the sense you mean. We don't know if there is anything in there that constitutes wanting. We don't know what it is. We have material and we have growth behavior and we have a lot of questions that we don't have answers to yet. But it's growing toward us. It's growing outward from its center. We're in one direction from that center." That was technically a different statement. The practical result was the same. Within 2 weeks we knew more, not enough but more. The lattice, the name came from the scientific reports first, which used the word to describe the crystalline growth pattern, and then it became the name the way names always do, sliding from technical vocabulary into common use before anyone decided on it, until the word appeared in every conversation about it from the laboratory to the mess hall to the supply depot. The lattice was spreading, not just in our crater. Reports came in from 3 other settlements in the southwest basin region over the following 10 days. The same hexagonal crystal formations on crater walls and ground surfaces, the same subsurface vibration signature preceding the surface emergence by 4 to 6 weeks, the same refusal of local animals to approach the growth zones. The animals knew before we did. They always do. One settlement, Noviport, a mining operation 140 kilometers from us that processed iron ore for the manufacturing hub at New Volgograd, reported that the lattice had penetrated their eastern perimeter fence overnight and begun growing on the structural supports of their primary habitat module. When the maintenance crew went to remove it at first light, their tools made no impression. Plasma cutters, tungsten drill heads, standard construction equipment rated for cutting native basalt. None of it touched the crystal matrix. The energy was absorbed and redistributed through the lattice network. The cuts made in the morning had been filled in by afternoon, the material regenerated from adjacent sections of the growth, the disruption erased as completely as if it had never happened. The settlement authority issued a guidance notice. Non-essential colonists in the southwest basin region should prepare for voluntary evacuation to the primary hub at New Volgograd. Transportation would be arranged. The evacuation was voluntary. There was an emphasis placed on that word voluntary that I understood clearly. It meant, we cannot compel you, the charter does not allow it, and we would prefer not to create the political problem of trying to force independent colonists off land they have developed at their own expense. So, voluntary, your decision, your risk. Galina called me the evening the notice came through. I was in the farmhouse, reading it for the 3rd time on the screen, as if a 3rd reading might reveal different information. She did not need to say what she was going to say. I could see it in her face before she spoke, the set of her jaw, the particular stillness that meant she had already worked through all the arguments and was delivering the conclusion rather than the process. "You're not leaving," she said. "I'm not leaving." Nikolai, not a question, not even a protest, just my name said the way she said it when she wanted me to hear what I sounded like. 19 years, I said. The angular cucumber strain, I've been developing that for 12 years. The seed stock is here in the barn if I leave and the lattice takes the seed bank. 12 years of work is gone. Nobody else has that strain. It feeds people Gallia. The lattice grows through metal. It ignored a plasma cutter. It's going to take the whole farm, Nikolai. It may take the whole crater. Maybe. Maybe. She said it with that particular flatness of a woman who has been married to a stubborn man for 31 years and loves him anyway and has no remaining illusions about changing him. Maybe it will, and maybe you will still be there when it does. I'll be careful. You'll be stubborn, she said, which you have always confused with careful and which is a different thing. She paused and something shifted in her face, the strategic withdrawal of the argument, a tactical decision. I'm coming down on the supply run next week. Don't be dead when I get there. I make no promises. She ended the call. I sat in the farmhouse and listened to the crater settle around me. The particular sounds of a place at night when you know it well enough to hear the individual voices in the ambient noise, the low cycle of the deflector net, the distant movement of cattle, the creak of thermal contraction in the equipment barn roof, and underneath all of it, so faint it might have been imagination, the 47-minute pulse. Still there, more present than before. The 6 labor platforms and I held a working meeting that night. I would not call it a staff meeting. They were not staff in any conventional sense, and the distinction mattered to me, not because I was sentimental about the platforms, but because precision about what things are tends to produce better decisions. They were labor platforms with sophisticated assessment capabilities, and I wanted their assessment. The lattice growth rate is accelerating, Boris said. Boris led with worst-case numbers always, which I had initially found dispiriting and had come to understand was correct practice. A tool that tells you comfortable things is not a useful tool. Current measured rate suggests crater wall coverage within 40 days. If the growth penetrates to the deflector net anchor points on the north and east walls, the anchor depth is 6 meters, but the lattice subsurface propagation has been measured at 4 to 5 meters in other locations. We lose net integrity. What happens to the net if we lose the anchors? Atmosphere retention fails. We drop to Martian standard within approximately 8 hours after net failure. And the lattice inside the net at that point. 3 clusters are already inside the perimeter, 2 in the eastern field, 1 on the outer barn wall. He paused. The eastern field clusters appeared overnight. Growth rate inside the crater appears to be faster than on the exterior walls. The enclosed atmosphere may be supporting accelerated growth. I looked at the clusters on the barn wall through the farmhouse window, faint in the lamplight. 2 new nodes of hexagonal perfection that had not been there when I went to sleep, growing in the warm, oxygen-enriched air of my crater as if I had provided them ideal conditions. "Andre," I said, "what does the lattice do with what it consumes? The organic matter in the soil, does it metabolize it? Does it produce anything? Does it change the surrounding soil chemistry?" Andre thought in his particular way, a stillness that was not absence but process. The conversion appears to be one way and essentially complete. Organic carbon compounds in contact with the growth front are incorporated into the crystalline matrix. The carbon becomes structural. The conversion products are new lattice material. There is no apparent waste stream, no excretion, no gas release, no residue. So it builds itself out of everything around it. Out of the organic material in the substrate, yes. The mineral fraction of the soil is not incorporated in the same way, but the organic carbon, everything grown, everything living, everything that was once living, that is the feedstock. I thought about the black hole in the outhouse. I thought about the fact that it consumed organic matter at a molecular level. I thought about the fact that what the lattice appeared to require, above everything else, was organic matter to convert into more lattice, and that the singularity housing disposed of organic matter by the simplest possible mechanism, by making it no longer exist. "Andre," I said, "what is the gravitational singularity in the waste housing rated for in terms of mass consumption, not what it typically processes, what it's rated for?" He had the manual indexed. He told me the rated maximum continuous consumption rate. The number was very large. Much larger than a farm's daily waste output required. The engineering had been done for ship-scale waste management, and the housing installed in my outhouse was the smallest unit in the product line, and even the smallest unit in the product line was built for a vessel carrying 200 people on a 3-year voyage. I sat with that number for a long time. What I was thinking was the thought of a desperate man, and I knew it. Desperate men on Mars are the rule rather than the exception. Nobody comes to Mars because conditions are easy, and the conditions have a way of producing the specific clarity of mind that comes from having no good options and needing to choose among the bad ones. The engineering corps had trained me for exactly this. Not for this specific problem, but for the category of problem. The available resources are insufficient for the conventional solution. So find the unconventional solution, and find it before the situation becomes irreversible. I was thinking, the lattice grows by consuming organic matter. The housing consumes organic matter. Could the housing consume the lattice? The lattice was silicon-based. The housing was designed for carbon-based organic waste. This was the central uncertainty. Andre had identified carbon compounds in the conversion process. The lattice, when it incorporated organic carbon, embedded that carbon in its crystalline structure. There was carbon in the lattice. Whether the housing would recognize that carbon-embedded crystalline matrix as a substrate it could process, I did not know. Nobody knew. Nobody had tried. Over the next 2 weeks, while the lattice continued its advance and the evacuation convoys moved north, I did 3 things. First, I moved the seed bank, the angular cucumber strain, all 12 years of selected genetics, the helical carrot lines, the geometric mushroom cultures, the cattle embryo storage, not the herd itself, but the frozen embryo stock from which the herd could, in principle, be rebuilt. All of it relocated to the deepest section of the equipment barn, behind a compacted regolith berm that Krivy and I and Boris built over 4 days with the loader and hand tools, and a great deal of labor that my back did not thank me for. 3 meters of compacted regolith and basalt gravel, faced with a layer of the ceramic composite we used for habitat repair. If the farm went, the genetics would survive. That mattered to me in a way I could articulate precisely. 12 years of work feeding people under Martian conditions cannot be reconstructed from scratch. It can be reconstructed from seed stock. The seed stock must survive. Second, I documented everything I could about the lattice. Its growth rate measured at 8 separate points around the crater perimeter. Its response to different stimuli. We tried heat, cold, electromagnetic interference at various frequencies, all producing no observable effect. The subsurface vibration patterns, charted against growth rate. The way it changed the electromagnetic signature of the soil around it. A subtle shift in the local magnetic field that Masha noticed when running routine equipment calibrations. Not dramatic enough to cause instrument errors, but consistent enough to appear in the logs if you knew to look for it. The way it oriented its growth, not randomly, but with a preference for organic-rich zones, steering toward the areas of highest soil carbon content, as if it could sense the food from a distance. All of this I sent to Irina Sorokina at New Volgograd, who was working around the clock with a growing team that now included 6 scientists from Earth who had come on the fast shuttle. Third, I started planning the relocation of the waste housing. The housing was a ceramic cylinder 1 meter in diameter and 2 meters long, sunk 12 meters into the crater floor through a steel-lined bore shaft. Removing it required drilling out 6 anchor bolts, which the platforms could manage with the farm's core drill over 3 days. The housing itself, once freed from the shaft, weighed 240 kilograms, manageable with the farm's loader, if the loader's rated capacity was not exceeded by more than the safety margin allowed, and I intended to operate within the safety margin because I was not in a position to damage the loader. Krivy did most of the fine work. His damaged shoulder actuator, which made him slower than the others on broad motion tasks, gave him the compensated precision that made him the best choice for operations requiring exact placement and delicate adjustment. He worked on the anchor bolts over 3 days with a patience that I found settling to watch. A careful, methodical intelligence applied to a task that required exactly that and nothing more. We emplaced the housing in its new location on the 29th day of 7th month, 11 days after I had made the decision to try this. The new location was the center of the largest lattice cluster in the eastern field, a formation that had expanded to approximately 40 meters across in the previous 10 days, and was, by Boris's assessment, the primary growth node in our crater sector, the point from which the growth in the field was radiating outward. I was working on theory, a theory formed by a man who was not a physicist and knew it, but who had spent 31 years solving problems with the tools available rather than the tools he wished he had. The theory could be completely wrong. I acknowledged this to myself with the clarity that comes from not being able to afford self-deception. We activated the housing at the new site at 700 on the 30th day of 7th month. For 3 days, nothing observable happened. The singularity surface was in contact with bare soil, not lattice. The lattice had not yet grown into contact with it. I waited, watching the growth front in the eastern field, measuring its daily progress. It moved toward the housing the way it moved toward everything, steadily, geometrically, indifferent to obstacles because it had never encountered an obstacle that was actually an obstacle. On the third night, Kriv reported from his overnight watch position. The lattice growth front had reached the housing. I was there by 3:30. The crater was cold in that deep pre-dawn way that seeps through even a good suit if you stand still long enough. Kriv was 8 meters back from the housing, sensor array active, logging everything. The lattice growth front was in contact with the ceramic surface on two sides. The crystal matrix at the contact point began to dissolve. Not shatter, not melt. Something different. The material ceased, one molecular layer at a time, drawn into the housing's field. The hexagonal perfection of it unmade itself silently in the dark, the lattice junctions unlocking in sequence, the silicon matrix collapsing not into fragments but into absence. The housing surface temperature dropped slightly, the thermal signature of something releasing energy as it was processed. And then the lattice responded. I had told myself I did not know what to expect. That was true. But there was a version of what I had expected, a simple encounter, the housing consuming material on contact, the lattice retreating from the site as it retreated from nothing else, and what actually happened was not that. The growth patterns in the eastern field changed. Not just at the contact point, everywhere in the field. The advancing fronts on the north and south sides of the cluster slowed. The subsurface vibration shifted in frequency, the steady 47-minute cycle breaking apart into shorter, irregular pulses. Something that functioned as a coordinating signal, something that kept the growth directed and purposeful, was being disrupted. And then the lattice concentrated toward the housing from 3 directions simultaneously. It was not retreat. It was not avoidance. It was a massed response, more crystal growth converging on the housing from multiple angles than I had seen in any single location before, the network pulling resources from adjacent areas and directing them at this point. The strategy was sound from a biological perspective. If a threat is consuming you at one point, overwhelm the threat with mass, cover it, bury it, break it. The housing consumed everything that touched it. The more mass the lattice brought, the faster it was consumed. The strategy that had worked against every other obstacle, overwhelm with growth, adapt, persist, was the wrong strategy against a device that processed material faster the more material was present. By 600, the housing had consumed everything within a 3-meter radius. By noon, the eastern field cluster was gone, not retreated, consumed. The bare Martian soil where 40 meters of crystal formation had stood was clean, cold, already showing the first signs of temperature cycling that meant it was responding to the environment again, that the lattice conversion had not penetrated all the way to the mineral substrate. I called Irina Sorokina. She had been monitoring my telemetry. She knew what had happened before I said a word. "It's retreating," she said, with the flatness of a scientist being precise. "It is retreating," I said, "in the eastern field, and the subsurface signal is fragmenting south of our position. The network is losing coherence in sectors around the consumption point," she said. "We're seeing it in the telemetry. Whatever coordinates the growth across distance, it appears to be a signal propagated through the subsurface network. When you disrupt enough of the network at a node, the disruption propagates outward. The isolated segments lose direction. Like an army that's lost communication with its headquarters." That is not a terrible analogy. "It's going around us," I said. "The eastern field is cleared. The north and west sectors are still growing. It's redirecting." "Yes, we see that." "How many singularity housings does the settlement authority have? Uninstalled or installed at evacuated settlements?" The pause on her end was thoughtful, not reluctant. She was working through the math the same way I was. I'll need to check the inventory. But Nikolai Petrovich, what you're describing is a perimeter defense using technology that was not designed for this purpose, operated by a farm crew that is not trained in. I know what I'm describing, I said. How many housings? She checked. 15 evacuated settlements in the southwest basin sector, each with a housing, plus 7 still occupied settlements whose housings were in use but could potentially be replicated if the supply depot had components. 15 housings, a crater perimeter of 35 kilometers, not enough to cover everything, but enough, placed correctly at growth node locations, to force the lattice to concentrate, and concentration was now the vulnerability. I needed people. People who could operate mining equipment, who could run a core drill in a Martian environment, who could move 240-kilogram housings across rough terrain and emplace them with the precision required for the containment seals to hold. I called Irina Sorokina back that evening and told her what I needed. She was quiet for a moment. The settlement authority has protocols for resource deployment. I know about the protocols, but there are colonists in New Volgograd right now who came from the southwest basin, people who evacuated, people who left farms and mines and stations. They are sitting in the hub looking at walls and waiting for someone to tell them there is something they can do. I let that sit for a moment. Tell them there is something they can do. She made calls. They came. Not all of them, not all at once. The settlement authority was involved, which meant approvals and safety briefings and a liability review that took 4 days and aged me. But they came, 18 people from 12 settlements, arriving in the transport vehicles that had carried them north, turning those vehicles around and coming back south. Miners who knew drilling equipment, habitat engineers, farmers. People who had already left once and understood the weight of leaving, who were being given the chance to stop leaving and start doing something instead. Galina arrived on the 9th day of the operation in the supply transport, with medical supplies and the expression of a woman who has made a decision and is not revisiting it. She did not explain herself. She said, "Where do you need me?" I put her in charge of logistics, supply management, personnel coordination, the daily tracking of who was where and what they needed. It was the right decision. Logistics is where operations fail, and she was better at it than I am, better than anyone on the crew. And she organized 18 people and 6 labor platforms across a 35-kilometer perimeter, with the same efficiency she brought to managing a trauma clinic's resources at 2 in the morning. We worked for 22 days. The housings came in from the evacuated settlements by transport, 2 and 3 at a time. The drilling teams, pairs of workers with the core drill equipment from 3 different settlements' tool inventories, bored new shaft locations at positions Boris identified from the subsurface mapping as primary growth nodes. The housings were emplaced, activated, and within days were processing lattice material as the growth fronts reached them. The lattice adapted. Every time the growth redirected around a housing, we moved to intercept. The platforms tracked the subsurface signal continuously, and when the fragmentation pattern showed a new concentration point building, we put a housing there. It was not fast. It was not elegant. It was the application of available resources to a moving problem by people who were tired and cold and operating on shorter sleep than was advisable, sustained by the specific stubbornness of people who have decided that the alternative to continuing is not acceptable. We lost the North Sector on the 14th day. 2 housings in the North Quadrant were overwhelmed when the lattice sent a growth front larger than anything we had seen before, not redirected, not avoidance behavior, but a direct assault on both positions simultaneously, pulling mass from a wide area of the subsurface network and driving it at 2 points at once. The housings consumed material as fast as they could. The growth front was faster. Both housing sites were buried under new crystal formation within 6 hours. The containment seals compromised. The housings inoperative. The north deflector net anchors failed at 2:23 hours on the 15th day. I was already awake. I heard the net alarm, and I was pulling on my suit before the sound registered consciously. 4 people were working in the northeast quadrant when the pressure dropped 2 of the drilling team from Novi Port and 2 of my own platforms, Andre and Vanya, who had been emplacing a replacement housing at anchor position 7. Andre reached all 4 of them within 6 minutes. He had been prepositioned with emergency breathers by Galina, who had placed emergency breathers at 6 locations around the perimeter that morning in the same routine way. She stocked the clinic's crash carts, without drama, because she understood that the function of emergency preparation is to be there before you know you need it. All 4 survived. 2 from the Novi Port crew had bruised lungs from the rapid pressure change. Galina treated them in the field with the medical kit she had brought from the clinic, in the dark, in a suit, with the deflector alarm still cycling. She did not need assistance. She had done harder procedures in worse circumstances. We pulled the perimeter back from the north sector, abandoning 40 meters of crater floor to the lattice, setting a new line closer in. Smaller, but the housing network held the new perimeter. On the 17th day, Irina Sorokina reported that the subsurface vibration signal had dropped below detectable levels in a 70-kilometer arc centered on the crater. "The network is fragmenting," she said. "The isolated segments are losing coordinated behavior. They're still growing, but the growth is becoming undirected, local, random, without the long-range coherence that made the advance organized." How long until the isolated segments become inert? I can't give you a reliable answer to that. Months, possibly years. The material doesn't deactivate, it just loses direction. It will need to be managed. But it can be managed. Yes, she said, it can be managed. On the 22nd day, the last major coordinated growth front retreated past the crater rim. I stood at the south perimeter at 600 and watched it go. The sunrise was the particular color it gets in late Martian summer, thin and rose gold, and impossibly clear, the kind of light that makes the crater walls look painted. The crystal growth that had been advancing on the south perimeter for 12 days was receding now, the growth front pulling back into the basalt, the surface crystals fatting as the network coherence that sustained them dissolved. In a week, there would be nothing on the south wall, but the mineral staining that was already there before any of this began. The crater was not undamaged. The north sector floor was still covered. The deflector net was running at 84% rated capacity, the north anchors temporarily replaced with mobile ground stakes that would hold through the current season, but would need permanent replacement before winter. We had lost some of the western field to lattice conversion that had penetrated too deep for the housings to reach in time. The barn wall carried permanent crystalline scarring on the northeast corner, where the first lattice had grown before we could stop it, fused to the structural composite in a way that was stable but could not be removed. But the crater was ours. The people who had come from the evacuated settlements stayed for 3 days of cleanup and repair before the transport came to take them north. I shook hands with each of them and said what there was to say. Some of them were going back to settlements they could reclaim now. Some were going back to settlements that were too far gone, where the lattice had been operating too long without the housing defense, where reclamation would take years. Those ones were quieter. I knew that quiet. I had been that quiet in Kasimov, walking off land that had been in my family for 4 generations. I hoped they would find what I had found. I did not say this. It is not the kind of thing you say to a person who has just lost their home. You say, the transport is on time, the weather is clear, the food in the hall is hot. You say the practical things, the other things they have to find themselves. Galina stayed an extra week. On the last evening before the supply transport took her back to the clinic, we walked the eastern field together in the long Martian dusk, the light going rose and then red, and then the deep maroon of the Martian horizon at night. The field was bare in the east where the first housing had operated, the soil clean and cold, already beginning the long process of biological recovery. The angular cucumber beds in the west section were intact. We could see the first new growth, stubborn little fractal shoots pushing up through the regolith, branching in their characteristic recursive patterns, oriented toward the fatting light. "Next season," Galena said. "Next season," I agreed. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. 31 years of marriage produces a vocabulary of silences that is more precise than words. On the fourth day after the retreat, I went back to the eastern field alone at dawn. The sun was coming over the crater rim in the way it does in late summer, at a low angle that makes the shadows very long and the light very thin, and the whole world look like something that has been through fire and survived it, which is, in its way, accurate. The frost on the bare soil caught the light and held it for a moment, each crystal of water ice briefly a small star, before the temperature rose past the frost point and they were gone. The cattle were in the eastern pasture. They had crossed the invisible line without hesitation that morning when I opened the gate, spreading across the frost-pale grass in the unhurried way of cattle who have decided that a place is safe and see no reason for urgency when the grass is adequate. They did not crowd the old lattice zone. They did not avoid it either. They grazed through it with the pragmatic indifference of animals that live entirely in the present tense, that register threat and register safety, and do not carry either one forward once the moment is past. I knelt and put my hand flat on the ground. Nothing, only the cold of the soil and the faint warmth of the frost melting under my palm, and the deep stillness of land that has been fought over and reclaimed, and is now simply land again, doing what land does, cycling through its slow processes, indifferent to what happened on its surface. When they eventually asked me, the scientists, the settlement authority officials, the journalists who came on the second fast shuttle from Earth with their recording equipment and their need to shape things into stories with clear lessons, when they asked me what I had been thinking, what had made me try what I tried, I told them the truth. I am a farmer from Ryazan Oblast. I grew up understanding that the land does not care about your intentions. It does not care about your fear or your plan or the elegant theory you developed in the farmhouse at midnight. It cares that you showed up, that you bent your back when the work required it, that you used what you had instead of waiting for what you wished you had. And I told them one other thing, which they mostly did not include in their reports, because it did not fit the shape they were looking for. I told them that the thing the lattice did not account for, the thing that no system optimized for infinite patience and geological time can easily account for, is the particular quality of stubbornness produced by a person who has already lost the thing they loved once and decided they will not lose it again. The lattice had millions of years of strategy. We had 19 years on this specific piece of ground, and the specific knowledge of what we would and would not accept, and the specific unwillingness to be moved that comes from having already been moved once and knowing what it costs. That is not nothing. In my experience, that is almost everything. Krivai was at work by the equipment barn when I came back from the eastern field, prepping the soil amendment spreader for the first pass of the new season, his damaged shoulder tilting slightly as he worked, compensation built into every movement. The geometric mushroom beds needed replanting. The helical carrots needed thinning in the west section where they had come through the crisis denser than ideal. The north sector would need attention before winter. The mobile stakes that held the deflector net could not stay through the pressure of a Martian winter storm. There was work, there is always work, that is not a complaint. Far to the south, where the Martian plain rolled away into the basin country, there was nothing moving. The basin was quiet. The subsurface was quiet. The 47-minute pulse was gone, replaced by the deep silence of deep rock that is not being disturbed by anything. I looked south for a long moment. Then I picked up my tools and went back to work.